Picture this. A wall of heavy cavalry is bearing down on you. 2,000 pounds of horse and armored knight, accelerating to 30 miles an hour. The earth trembles beneath their hooves. You're a peasant. In your hands is a wooden staff with a crude iron tube lashed to the end. You don't run. You don't pray. You wait. You touch a flame to a fuse. Then the sound rips through the air. A shrill, screaming whistle. A lead ball tears forward and punches through a knight's breastplate like it's thin parchment. The horse crumples. The rider is dead before his body hits the mud. The weapon you just fired is called a pistula. In Czech, it means whistle. It's the great-grandfather of every firearm in existence today. That word traveled across borders and centuries until it became something familiar to you right now. Pistol. This weapon didn't just kill a knight. It killed the Middle Ages. And the man who put it in your hands was Jan Žižka. Before we dive into this forgotten story of survival and suffering, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths of history, consider liking this video and subscribing for more long-form content like this. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from. It's incredible that we're piecing together ancient stories from all over the world, connected across time by curiosity. History loves the young and the beautiful. Alexander the Great, Napoleon. Žižka was neither. He enters our story as a broken man in his 60s. One eye is already gone, torn out years earlier, leaving a scarred, flattened patch of skin where it once was. He's poor. A minor noble from Trochnov, who spent decades as a mercenary, doing the kind of violent work kings preferred not to talk about. He wasn't a hero. He was a survivor, a man who understood the brutal math of street fights and ambushes. But in 1419, the Kingdom of Bohemia wasn't looking for a hero. It was looking for an executioner. The Catholic Church had just burned the reformer Jan Hus at the stake, igniting a religious rebellion that threatened to tear Europe apart. Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund, the Red Fox himself, marched on Prague with the Pope's blessing. His orders were simple: exterminate the heretics, burn their villages, kill the men, and silence the revolt. Sigismund brought the finest army in Christendom. The Hussites had farmers, women, and priests. It looked like a massacre waiting to happen. But Žižka saw what the emperor didn't. When he looked at these terrified peasants, he didn't see victims. He saw engineers. He saw hands that could turn farm wagons into fortresses and harvest tools into weapons of mass slaughter. The test came immediately. March 1420. The Battle of Sudomierz. Žižka is caught in the open with 400 followers, men, women, and children, and just 12 farm wagons. Charging toward them are 2,000 royalist heavy cavalry, the ironclad elite of Europe. The odds are 5-1. The sun is setting. The terrain is a trap. By every rule of medieval warfare, Žižka is already dead. But as the knights lower their lances and spur their horses, they aren't charging into a battle. They're charging into a machine. Žižka had chosen his ground carefully. He stood on a narrow dam between two fish ponds. On his left, the deep waters of Lake Markovich. On his right, the drained bed of Lake Shkarady, a surface that looked solid, but was actually a sucking mire of soft clay. He positioned his 12 wagons across the dam, forming a crude barricade, and waited. The royalist commander, Bohuslav of Schwamberg, laughed when he saw it. Peasants pinned against water. No escape. The knights didn't bother scouting the terrain. Why would they? They were the tanks of the 15th century. They lowered their visors, narrowing their vision to a slit, and charged for the dry pond bed on the right flank. planning to sweep around the wagons and slaughter the heretics from behind. The charge began with thunder. Hooves tore into the ground, and then the earth betrayed them. As the war horses hit the drained lake bed, the clay gave way. Momentum died instantly. Horses sank to their bellies, screaming and thrashing. Knights in 60 pounds of plate armor were thrown into the muck like stones, and then the trap closed. Before the battle, the Hussite women had done something strange. They removed their long veils and spread them across the mud. To the knights, it looked like discarded laundry. But as the dismounted men struggled forward, the jagged spurs on their boots caught in the thick fabric. They tripped. They fell face first into the suffocating clay. This was the moment Žižka had engineered. The Hussites didn't fight with swords. They fought with tools. The flail, a wooden staff with an iron club attached by a chain, had been used for generations to thresh grain. Now it threshed men. Peasants swarmed the trapped knights. They didn't aim for gaps in armor. They didn't need to. They swung with centrifugal force, iron clubs crashing down onto expensive German helmets. The steel didn't need to break. The shock shattered skulls, snapped necks, and turned brains to pulp inside the armor. The sound wasn't the ring of sword on sword. It was the wet, dull crunch of metal collapsing onto bone. By nightfall, the pride of Catholic cavalry lay broken in the mud. Bohuslav of Schwamberg was wounded and captured. The survivors fled into darkness, leaving behind their dead and their dignity. Žižka didn't celebrate. He studied the field. Sudomierz proved terrain could equalize the odds, but swamps aren't everywhere. He needed a way to bring the fortress with him. As he looked at the blood-splattered wagons that had held the line, an idea took shape. He was imagining the Wagenburg. To understand how a blind man defeated an empire, you have to understand what he built next. History calls it the Wagenburg, the wagon fort. But calling it a wagon is like calling a modern tank a cart. Žižka took the ordinary Bohemian farm wagon and militarized every inch of it. Thick oak planks reinforced the sides, turning them into ballistic shields that could stop crossbow bolts and early gunfire. Heavy iron chains hung beneath the chassis, sweeping the ground to prevent enemy infantry from crawling underneath and cutting the horses' legs. Retractable wooden roofs protected the crew from arrows raining down from above. But the real genius wasn't the wood. It was the people inside. Each wagon wasn't a vehicle. It was a tactical unit. 18 to 20 specialists, each with a defined role. A driver, 2 Pavis shield bearers to protect reloaders, 6 crossbowmen, 2 handgunners armed with pistula, 4 flailmen, 2 pikemen. This wasn't a mob of peasants. It was an assembly line of death. Žižka drilled them relentlessly. When the enemy charged, crossbowmen and handgunners fired in disciplined volleys. One rank shot, then stepped back to reload as shield bearers moved forward to cover them. The early gunners didn't aim for precision. They aimed for sound, thunderous noise that terrified horses long before steel ever touched flesh. Between the wagons, Žižka mounted small cannons called Hufneis, a word meaning crowd, because that's exactly what they were designed to fire into. Short-barreled, loaded with shrapnel, not for sieges but for slaughter. This weapon would later give its name to the modern howitzer. When chained wheel to wheel, the wagons formed a geometric fortress that could be assembled in minutes. It solved the oldest problem in warfare: how infantry survives a cavalry charge in open terrain. Knights would charge expecting the line to break. Instead, they slammed into a wall of oak, iron, smoke, and noise. Horses shied away from the gunfire, forcing riders to move sideways along the wagon wall. That was the kill zone. From gaps between wagons, flailmen and pikemen reached out, hooked riders from their saddles, dragged them down, and finished them in the dirt. Brutal, efficient, industrial. And the Wagenburg had one more secret. It could move. Using flag signals, Žižka trained his drivers to execute complex maneuvers. The formation could expand to envelop an enemy or open to release cavalry for a counterattack. Imagine a fortress that could dismantle itself, chase you down, and then lock itself back into an impenetrable wall. This was the force Emperor Sigismund was marching toward in the summer of 1420. He arrived outside Prague with a crusader army estimated between 50 and 100,000 men. The city panicked. Hussite factions argued among themselves. They were outnumbered, surrounded, and fractured. Their last hope was a narrow hill just outside the city walls. If the Crusaders took it, Prague would starve. Žižka didn't hesitate. He took a small detachment, only a few dozen men and women, and occupied the hill. They dug trenches, built 2 crude log forts, and carved a ditch into the rock. From below, it looked laughable. On July 14th, 1420, the flower of European chivalry looked up at that hill and saw dirt mounds and an old, half-blind man waiting. They assumed it would be over before lunch. The Battle of Witkov Hill became a lesson in geometry. The hill was a narrow, rocky spine, steep on both sides, with only a thin path leading to the summit. Sigismund had thousands of knights, but only a handful could fight abreast on that ridge. His army was an ocean trying to pour through a straw. Elite knights led the assault, armored and confident, shouting insults as they charged uphill. They expected the peasants to flee. Instead, they hit a wall of flails, stones, and screaming defenders. From a knight's perspective, the world collapsed into chaos. The path was too narrow for horses. The slope was slick with summer grass. As the front ranks stalled against Žižka's wooden palisade, the men behind kept pushing, crushing their own comrades against the rocks. Despite his age and failing sight, Žižka stood in the forward trench. Legend says he fought guided by sound alone, swinging his weapon toward noise and motion, holding the line until he was nearly dragged into the enemy ranks by a grappling hook. The Crusaders were winning by inches. Their weight was beginning to splinter the wooden defenses. Then the bell rang. From Prague below, church bells thundered. The southern gate burst open. A flood of civilians poured out. Bakers, butchers, housewives, armed with clubs, axes, and farm tools, charging uphill while singing hymns. They slammed into the exposed flank of the Crusader column. Panic spread instantly. Knights at the rear, seeing a screaming mob, assumed they were surrounded by a massive army. They tried to retreat, but the path was blocked by their own men pushing forward. The withdrawal turned into a stampede. Horses reared and fell from cliffs. Armored men tumbled down rocky slopes, breaking bodies before they ever hit the ground. From a distant hill, Emperor Sigismund watched his invincible army disintegrate. He withdrew, had himself crowned King of Bohemia in a rushed ceremony to save face, then fled the country. The siege of Prague was broken. Žižka was no longer just a commander. To his followers, he was becoming something else entirely. Victory at Witkov Hill transformed Žižka into more than a general. To the Hussites, he became a chosen instrument of God. But the war was far from finished, and the most dangerous enemies were no longer outside Bohemia. They were within. Factions hardened. Greed crept in. Theology turned violent. And for Žižka, the darkness was about to become literal. In 1421, during a minor siege at Rabi Castle, fate found him. A stray arrow, or perhaps a splinter from a pear tree shattered by cannon fire, struck his remaining good eye. Infection followed. The physicians tried everything, but the damage was done. Jan Žižka was now completely blind. For most commanders, that would have been the end. How do you lead an army when you can't see the terrain, the enemy, or even the sky? Žižka didn't retire. He evolved. As his world collapsed into permanent blackness, his mind sharpened. Inside his command tent, there was no light. But in his head, the battlefield existed as a grid of ruthless clarity. He forced war to become data. He surrounded himself with trusted aides, his eyes, and demanded precision. Not "the enemy is over there," but measurements. How steep is the slope? How deep is the mud? Which way is the wind pushing the smoke? Where is the sun relative to the enemy's visor slits? From these details, he constructed a living, three-dimensional map in his mind. Historians compare it to blindfold chess played at a grandmaster level, except every move cost lives. To command what he couldn't see, Žižka standardized communication. Flags for captains, drum rhythms for soldiers. One beat meant reload, another meant rotate the wagons, another meant close ranks. Out of necessity, he created order. In 1423, this became law. Žižka's military ordinance was one of the first formal codes of conduct in Central Europe. Noble or peasant, the rules were the same. Theft meant death. Disobedience meant death. Breaking formation to loot meant death. He turned a religious mob into a professional machine. When he pointed a finger in the darkness of his tent, thousands moved in daylight. Then came Kutna Hora. Late in 1421, Emperor Sigismund returned with Hungarian cavalry and German mercenaries. Kutna Hora was Europe's silver capital, populated by German Catholic miners who despised the Hussites. Žižka marched there expecting a defensible position. Instead, he walked into a betrayal. The miners slaughtered the Hussite garrison and opened the gates to Sigismund's army. Imperial forces surrounded Žižka from outside while the hostile city loomed at his back. He was encircled. No food, no reinforcements, freezing cold. Sigismund decided to wait. Hunger would finish the blind dog by morning. Inside the city, a nightmare unfolded. Captured Hussites were dragged to deep mine shafts and thrown in alive. One pit alone swallowed over 1,000 people. The screams echoed upward as a warning. Surrender meant death in the dark. Žižka didn't plan to surrender. He planned geometry. At midnight on December 21st, 1421, he did the unthinkable. He attacked. The Wagenburg reformed, not into a defensive circle, but a narrow column, a moving corridor of wood and iron. Every cannon, every handgun, every crossbow concentrated on a single point in the imperial line. It was the first mobile artillery barrage in history. Imperial soldiers saw a wall of fire erupt in the darkness. Hoofknives blasted shrapnel at point-blank range, tearing a tunnel through flesh and bone. Horses panicked. The noise alone shattered morale. Žižka drove his entire army straight through the breach without stopping to fight. By the time Sigismund understood what was happening, the Hussites were gone. 2 weeks later, they returned. Žižka refitted, turned around, and struck at Nebovidi. The imperial army, dispersed and drunk on victory, collapsed. As they fled across the frozen Sazava River, the ice broke. Knights drowned, dragged under by the armor meant to save them. Žižka hadn't escaped a trap. He had converted it into a grave. With Sigismund beaten back, the Hussite movement fractured. Moderates in Prague wanted peace. Radicals in Tabor wanted revolution. When extremist Adamites began roaming naked and violent, Žižka ended the debate with fire and steel. To him, discipline was absolute. In 1424, Prague's nobles turned against him. At the Battle of Malashov, Žižka faced an enemy who knew his tactics, so he invented new ones. He packed wagons with rocks, waited until the enemy filled the valley below, then sent them crashing downhill like wooden avalanches. The charge that followed was a massacre. After Malashov, no one dared challenge him. Žižka turned outward, launching brutal raids into Hungary and Austria. These weren't conquests, they were warnings. Villages burned, supplies vanished, entire regions panicked at rumors of his approach. He defeated enemies before battles even began. In 1424, at the siege of Przemysław, his luck finally ended. A carbuncle, likely the plague, consumed him from within. The undefeated general died not to steel, but to bacteria. His soldiers renamed themselves the Orphans. They believed their father was gone, but his legacy wasn't. 7 years later, in 1431, a fifth crusade marched into Bohemia. Over 100,000 men, confident, loud, and then they heard it, singing. A deep, synchronized hymn drifting through the forest, followed by the rhythmic rumble of wagons. Panic spread. Before the Hussites even appeared, the crusade collapsed. Men ran, weapons dropped. Cardinal Cesarini fled in disguise. It was a victory won without a fight, won by memory. Žižka had changed war forever. The Wagenburg, the Pistula, armored mobility, psychological warfare. Every modern battlefield still echoes with his ideas. A blind man armed peasants with conviction and cheap technology, and shattered empires.